The dust is lying. Through the swirling orange haze of the southern Iraqi desert, the T-72s crawl forward in formation, paint chipped, barrels raised, vision slits glowing with static. Soviet-trained Iraqi crews peer into the void through analog optics, hunting silhouettes in the heat shimmer. Nothing moves, no enemy tank, no smoke, just dead terrain. Then one erupts. A fireball tears its turret into the sky, slicing a shrieking arc before vanishing into ash. No impact trail, no warning. Seconds later, a second tank splits at the seams, its crew never even identifying the direction of death. Radio chatter breaks into confusion. Someone screams about air attack, but there's no engine sound, no shadows, only sand from a forward listening post built to intercept radio transmissions from the American armor comes a broken report. They're hitting us from the dark. We can't see them. They're ghosts. Back at the regimental HQ. A Soviet advisor pounds the table. Impossible. They can't see through this storm, but they can. Thermal optics don't care about wind or dust. Digital fire control doesn't need a clear sky. GPS doesn't miss. 17 tanks gone in 7 minutes. No return fire. A third company refuses to move forward, not from cowardice, but because they no longer know where the enemy is. Their steel advantage, their numbers, their Soviet-built armor, none of it matters. These aren't tanks they're fighting. They're algorithms with cannons. To Moscow, the reports are nonsense. Fabrications. The Americans can't fight blind. No one can. But as the last tank burns, its silhouette barely visible through the heat shimmer, a new signal cuts across encrypted channels, an American voice target neutralized. No casualties. Continuing east, that one line travels thousands of miles through Baghdad, through Warsaw Pact channels, through encrypted Soviet satellites, and in a classified military building outside Moscow. A Soviet general reads it once. Then again, he doesn't understand. But the Americans do. Moscow had no idea what they were looking at. But the Americans did. They were laughing. Not out of joy, but certainty. In a secure briefing room beneath the General Staff Building in Moscow. Winter 1990. 20 Soviet officers sat in confident silence as a KGB analyst clicked through reconnaissance slides. The photographs were clear American tanks, too few, American airfields, too far, American doctrines, too theoretical, one major, arms crossed, smirked. They have machines, we have men. Across the table, a GRU colonel presented the updated estimates. The U.S. had roughly 1,800 main battle tanks in theater. The Iraqi army, Soviet-trained and equipped, had nearly 4,500. On paper, it was no contest. They rely on computers, a marshal said. We rely on steel. The group nodded. Their worldview was intact. Quantity, mass, saturation, these were the iron laws of war, tested on the Eastern Front and refined over decades. Iraq's defensive belts mirrored Soviet strategy overlapping fields of fire, hardened positions, depth through dispersion. A radar technician chuckled as he adjusted his glasses. Let's see them find targets in a sandstorm. The laughter grew. To them. American overconfidence in precision systems was a kind of decadence, clean war fantasies for men who had never fought in mud or snow. One general dismissed the F-117 outright. Stealth. You mean invisible planes we have radar. There was no dissent. No one in that room believed America could pose a real strategic threat. Not in ground warfare. Their assumptions were not just doctrine. They were ideology. And the data they chose to believe only reinforced it. Satellite estimates of U.S. deployments showed small, mobile formations. Not enough mass to hold ground. Too little artillery. Too few men. They ignored joint training exercises. scoffed at real-time command systems, and rolled their eyes at thermal imagery. Their confidence wasn't arrogance, it was faith backed by decades of doctrine, drills, and numbers. A younger officer tried to raise a concern. He'd reviewed reports from NATO exercises where American fire control systems had outpaced Soviet response times, but his voice was drowned in laughter. A senior general shut him down. Let them come. Our tanks are waiting. Then came the final slide, a projected loss chart. It showed an attrition-based scenario. In every simulation, even with early American gains, Soviet-equipped forces ground them down by week 3. War is mathematics, one said. And the math is on our side. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, is that the numbers were lying. And their laughter was the first mistake. For the Soviet Union, war was physics. And physics favored mass. Their doctrine had been forged in the infernos of World War II, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, where waves of tanks, artillery, and infantry drowned the enemy under sheer volume. That logic was preserved, institutionalized, and exported. To Iraq, to Syria, to Vietnam, to Warsaw Pact states. It became a dogma. Whoever had more survived longer. Their armor doctrine followed this to the letter. The T-72 wasn't a tank built for survivability through innovation. It was designed to be built fast, in thousands, by workers who could be retrained in weeks. Armor sloped for ricochet, guns standardized across units, silhouettes low for ambush defense. The theory, if one tank dies, 3 more can strike. Behind every tank unit was doctrine-layered depth, motorized rifle divisions, mobile artillery, anti-aircraft assets, reserves upon reserves. Reinforcement timelines were calculated down to the hour. There was no such thing as outnumbered in Soviet planning, only overextended. But it wasn't just tanks. In the skies, Soviet air doctrine leaned on ground control interception. Pilots didn't hunt. They were guided. From command bunkers, radar operators directed MiGs toward threats. Soviet aircraft weren't autonomous predators. They were weapons systems, dependent on radar grids and pre-planned vectors. Control was everything. Air defense followed the same rule, layer upon layer. High-altitude threats, S-75 and S-200. Medium S-125, low-flying intruders, ZSU-23s and SA-8s. No single system needed to be perfect. The net only had to hold. And when it came to intelligence, they believed in people, human over machines, KGB field agents, GRU moles, spies recruited through ideology or pressure. Data was a human product, not satellite feeds, not electronic intercepts. In this worldview, a defector could change the outcome of a war. A photograph. Not so much. That was the Soviet system. It was redundant. It was layered. It was immense. And on paper, it worked. A single American breakthrough could be absorbed, then crushed. A stealth bomber might evade one SAM site, but not 6. A tank might score a kill, but not survive the counterstrike. Precision was a boutique idea, unreliable, unscalable. But what they never anticipated, what no equation ever considered, was a force that could see through darkness, strike from kilometers away, and vanish before anyone could respond. A system not based on mass, but fusion. Not dependent on steel, but on timing, data, and invisible coordination. The doctrine was sound, until it wasn't. It happened just after dusk. February 1991, the Battle of 73 Easting had not yet begun, but the Americans were already watching. From the command interface inside an M1A1 Abrams tank, Staff Sergeant Craig M. clicked into his thermal viewer. What appeared as featureless desert to the human eye was, to his screen, a glowing field of heat signatures, dozens of them. Stationary, quiet, dug in. tanks. The enemy didn't know they were being watched. 3,000 meters away, behind a rise, T-72s lay in wait. They had no thermal vision, no GPS fix, no awareness they had been spotted. The sandstorm had masked movement. Soviet doctrine told them this was safety, darkness, dust, confusion, all advantages to the defender. But the Americans didn't need light. With one-word fire, the Abrams let loose. The depleted uranium shell punched through air, dust, and steel. In less than 5 seconds, the lead T-72 was gone. Its turret separated cleanly from the hull. No smoke trail, no engine flare, just disappearance. Before the Iraqis could respond, a second tank vanished. Then a third. From the Soviet perspective, nothing made sense. There was no gun flash, no impact delay, no sound of aircraft, just eruptions, sudden, final. Their sensors' optical rangefinders and manual scopes saw nothing but haze. Their radios erupted in shouts. Where are they? How far? What direction? But there was no answer. There was no visibility. Not for them. Inside the Abrams, the crew stayed calm. Digital fire control systems automatically compensated for wind, humidity, and barrel temperature. Laser rangefinders recalculated every 1.2 seconds. Target tracking computers removed guesswork. What the gunners saw was what the gun hit. Another T-72 lit up. Somewhere along the Iraqi line, a tank commander tried to counterfire. He ordered his gunner to engage at estimated distance. The Soviet-designed FCS wasn't built for active combat at that range, especially not in storm conditions. The shot went wide over the crest and into nothing. 10 seconds later, his tank was gone too. In under 4 minutes, 9 armored vehicles had been destroyed. Not a single return shot had landed. Not a single American tank had been seen. The T-72 was built for mass, for saturation, or for close-in formation battles where quantity meant survival. But here, the battlefield had changed. It was no longer a contest of armor thickness, shell weight, or angle of slope. It was a contest of who could see first and who could shoot faster. And the Soviet machine never had a chance. This should not have been possible. The reports were dismissed before they were even read. Within days of the first tank engagements in the Iraqi desert, GRU channels lit up with confused, contradictory data. Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi units sent encrypted updates, unreturned engagements, rapid armor losses, and complete breakdowns in communication under fire. The tone was uniform panic. But the response from Moscow was uniform, too, disbelief. A senior general in the main operations directorate read the preliminary figures, 18 T-72s lost in a single engagement. 0 confirmed American casualties, and tossed the folder back onto the table. Propaganda, he said flatly. At the KGB's headquarters on Lubyanka Square, internal analysts warned that something anomalous was happening in the theater. Their conclusions were cautious, speculative. Perhaps a new fire control system, perhaps an unseen air asset. But the committee chairman interrupted. Iraqi soldiers are weak. Their command collapses under pressure. This is not a systems failure. This is a people problem. In the Soviet mindset, nothing about Desert Storm aligned with their understanding of warfare. Battles were not supposed to be bloodless on one side. Superiority came through waves, through density, through exchanges. A kill ratio of 1.5 was considered good, but 20 Marsuru, that wasn't combat. That was fiction. Moscow's military press, still under tight control, pushed the official line. American media was exaggerating. U.S. technology was untested in full-scale conflict. Any Iraqi losses were likely due to strategic error, not superiority in hardware. Privately, the tone was colder. Let them have their Hollywood war, one Air Force colonel said. We'll see the real numbers when they land in Baghdad. But they never did. More field reports trickled in. Entire tank battalions lost before firing a shot. Convoys destroyed from beyond visual range. Air defense units overwhelmed before acquiring targets. A GRU intercept from a downed Iraqi communication suggested their radar systems weren't even registering threats before destruction. They are killing us from places we can't target. It read, "We are blind, and still." Moscow denied it. They clung to explanations rooted in what they knew: sandstorms, poor training, radar interference, command disorganization, anything but the possibility that the U.S. had built a system designed not just to fight, but to disappear. They were presented with the data. They saw the outcomes. But they chose to believe in the war they had prepared for, not the one they were losing. When denial failed, the explanations began. The first Soviet theory to gain traction within the general staff wasn't tactical, it was technological. According to a classified memorandum circulated between the GRU and the Air Defense Forces, the Americans weren't winning with weapons. They were cheating physics, electronic masking. The report claimed. Possibly plasma-based? The idea was elegant. In a way. It proposed that American tanks were using high-frequency electronic fields to distort their visibility across radar and thermal bands. Essentially, they were ghost reflections bouncing in and out of sensor ranges, impossible to pin down. A KGB engineer expanded on the theory they are creating a mirage. What we see is not where they are. This narrative spread quickly through command briefings and military journals. It explained the unexplainable. Why radars lost lock without interference. Why thermal signatures appeared and vanished. Why incoming fire came from coordinates where nothing had been moments earlier. The Americans had mastered deception, not in combat strategy, but in physics, in classrooms at the Frunze Military Academy. Lecturers began referencing ghost signatures and the theoretical manipulation of the infrared spectrum. Some suggested the Americans had found a way to pulse their emissions, firing between sweeps of tracking systems. Others claimed they were hacking Iraqi sensors with jamming pulses or fake echoes. There was just one problem. None of it matched reality. Captured American equipment showed no evidence of exotic emitters or stealth fields. The M1A1 Abrams had no cloaking device, no frequency modulators. It relied on brute technology, powerful optics, composite armor, digital fire control, and GPS. It didn't trick radar. It simply didn't need to be seen. The theory also failed basic logic. If the Abrams was invisible, why were their heat signatures plainly recorded in post-battle recon? Why were wrecked Iraqi tanks all hit at precise locations? Turret ring, ammunition cook-off, rear deck. This wasn't electronic sorcery. It was first-shot precision. But the plasma mirage theory persisted not because it was right, but because it was comforting. It allowed Soviet officers to believe the battlefield had been warped by some new American black science, that their tanks weren't outmatched, just outhacked. Believing in a magic trick was easier than accepting their entire doctrine had been outpaced. So they held on to it, they repeated it, they briefed it, and for a while, they believed it. But belief has a half-life. And when the plasma mirage failed to explain mounting battlefield humiliations, a darker theory took its place, one that didn't just misunderstand American systems, but rejected the entire idea of technological superiority. This time, the enemy wasn't electronics. It was theater. A new directive circulated through certain Soviet Air Force circles. The kills are staged. The Americans, they argued, were broadcasting a carefully curated performance. Satellite footage, gun cam clips, and news broadcasts were being edited in real time to exaggerate U.S. dominance. Iraqi tank losses faked or self-inflicted. American precision CGI for the Pentagon press room. The war is not being fought on the ground. One colonel wrote in a classified Air Force cable, "It is being fought on television." Supporters of this theory pointed to the apparent perfection of American operations. No blue-on-blue incidents, no friendly fire, no chaos. Just a clean, surgical campaign that defied the known nature of war. But reality was not cooperating. By week 2 of Operation Desert Storm, Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi units began defecting or simply going silent. Entire Iraqi divisions disintegrated under American strikes they never saw. Drone footage leaked through back channels showed unmistakable wreckage. Soviet-built tanks torn open, APCs shredded, anti-aircraft sites obliterated before launch. Still, the theory evolved. Some claimed the F-117 wasn't a real aircraft. It was a holographic decoy backed by standoff munitions. Others speculated that American tanks were sabotaging enemy optics with microwave pulses, blinding gunners before striking. One GRU think tank even posited that American satellites were interfering with Soviet fire control frequencies, rewriting targeting data mid-flight. It is not a war of tanks. The paper concluded, it is a war of illusions. But illusions don't leave 30-ton turrets 50 meters from their hulls. The Soviets were desperate to rationalize what they were seeing. But in doing so, they wandered further from truth. The deeper they dug, the more absurd their theories became, each one less plausible than the last. Built not on evidence, but fear. Fear that something fundamental had shifted, and they weren't equipped to understand it. They weren't discovering the American system. They were inventing an enemy that didn't exist, while the real one was destroying them. They were solving a problem that didn't exist. They had the networks, they had the agents, they had the satellites, and they saw nothing. As American armor and stealth aircraft moved with surgical precision across the Iraqi desert, the full might of Soviet intelligence was mobilized to decode the mystery. The GRU activated long-silent assets. The KGB sent encrypted cables to its networks in Jordan, Syria, even inside Baghdad. Radar logs were smuggled, wreckage was photographed, every source was tapped. But the puzzle remained unsolved. A GRU intercept team recovered fragments of an M1A1's composite armor from a destroyed convoy site. Their analysis returned confused results. Materials unknown, not steel, not ceramic. Something else, later known to the West as Chobham armor. 2 Soviet metallurgists. It was alchemy. Their satellite overpasses, carefully timed, failed to detect any pre-movement buildup by American forces. It wasn't timing. It was trickery. The U.S. had moved its stealth aircraft under cloud cover and beyond known satellite paths. Their bases had deployed during weather gaps. By the time the satellites looked again, the battlefield had already changed. KGB operatives embedded in the region failed to capture reliable intelligence on American unit movements. By the time they intercepted Iraqi communications, those positions were already obsolete. American digital encryption rendered most traffic unreadable. The intelligence chiefs grew increasingly desperate. Orders were issued to collect physical remains, spent shell casings, guidance fins, avionics scrap. What little they recovered only deepened the mystery. The guidance systems weren't just modern. They were alien cold, integrated, sealed from reverse engineering, no exposed logic boards, no easy vulnerabilities. It was the system they couldn't grasp. The U.S. that wasn't deploying standalone tech, it was deploying networked capabilities fused across domains. Tank units received real-time GPS data piped directly into their fire control computers. Aircraft coordinated with ground units using secure data links invisible to conventional SIGINT. Sensors from drones, satellites, and scouts were merged into one battlespace picture, updated second by second. There was no single weakness to exploit, no lone prototype to study. Each weapon was a node. Each node, part of a greater machine, to the Soviet mind, trained on linear doctrine and siloed information. This was black magic. No doctrine had been written to fight a force that never exposed its flank. No theory had prepared them for an enemy that vanished before engagement and struck with pixel-perfect accuracy. The most brutal realization came from within the GRU. They are not hiding their technology. They are hiding their process. The Americans weren't just ahead. They had rewritten the rules of detection, deployment, and destruction. Every Soviet asset was being used. Every method was deployed. But they couldn't touch it. They were looking at a ghost. It was never one weapon, never one breakthrough. What shattered the Soviet war machine wasn't an invincible tank or an invisible jet. It was a system, a constellation of technologies, doctrines, and digital integrations so far beyond Soviet thinking that even when the wreckage lay smoking in the sand, they still couldn't see what had killed them. It began with sight. American tanks didn't need daylight. They saw heat. Every M1A1 Abrams was equipped with second-generation thermal imagers capable of detecting engine signatures from over 3 kilometers, even through smoke, dust, or total darkness. Iraqi tank crews, trained in Soviet optics, saw nothing but gray blur. The Americans saw targets, and they hit them first. But seeing wasn't enough. They also hit with precision. The Abrams digital fire control system calculated range, movement, wind, barrel droop, and humidity in milliseconds. While a T-72 gunner adjusted manually, relying on guesswork and experience, the American gunner simply locked and fired, at range, in motion. At night, it didn't matter. First shot, first kill. Behind the steel, another miracle Chobham armor. The Soviets never cracked its secret. Layers of ceramic, steel, and synthetic materials arranged in complex matrices absorbed, deflected, and disrupted kinetic penetrators. Even direct hits from 125mm Soviet shells failed to breach. What Soviet engineers assumed was just Western composite turned out to be a mathematical shield designed to defeat shaped charges at the atomic level. But armor and guns were only the surface. Above them flew the F-117 Nighthawk, shaped like a jagged shadow, faceted to scatter radar returns, coated with radar-absorbent material RAM, and guided by terrain-matching GPS systems. The F-117 didn't fight air defense. It erased the entire concept. Soviet SAM rings built on overlapping radar coverage failed to track it at all. Iraqi radar operators watched empty skies while bombs hit command bunkers with meter-level precision. What connected it all, what made it deadly, was fusion. The U.S. military had mastered digital integration. GPS satellites triangulated tank positions in real time. Commanders shared targeting data over secure data links. AWACS aircraft fed enemy movements into centralized battle maps. A scout drone spotting armor could transmit coordinates directly to an Abrams battery. There was no delay, no manual relay, no blind maneuver. Even American infantry carried digital radios and night vision, a complete tactical loop from soldier to satellite. To the Soviets, This wasn't warfare. It was science fiction. Their doctrine still separated ground, air, and intelligence into compartments. Information moved at the speed of paperwork. Their tanks were blind. Their aircraft were tethered to radar stations. Their missiles waited for orders that arrived too late. In the American system, data was a weapon. Precision was standard. Speed was absolute. No single component won the war. The F-117 couldn't hold ground. The Abrams couldn't fly. But together, linked, protected, guided, they formed something new. A battlefield intelligence machine, and once activated, it didn't fight fair. It didn't need to. It saw first, it shot first, it moved faster, and it never missed. They called it 73 Easting. To most Soviet generals, it was just a grid reference. But to the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, it was the moment when two worlds collided and only one walked away. February 26, 1991, the storm had cleared. The sand no longer howled. But what followed was worse. American scouts advanced east through southern Iraq under a sky split with overcast. Thermal imagers swept the terrain, searching. What they found wasn't just a few tanks, it was an entire defensive belt. Iraqi Republican Guard positions, T-72s dug in across dunes, hulls half buried, cannons ready, Soviet-style formation, classic doctrine, and completely exposed. The American lead element, Eagle Troop, spotted them first. At over 2,800 meters, far beyond Iraqi range, their optics lit up, not shadows, not guesses, targets. Captain H.R. McMaster Young, aggressive and perfectly trained, gave the order not to stop, not to hold, but to press forward and engage on the move. Abrams tanks surged over ridgelines, firing as they drove. The first volley knocked out 3 T-72s. The second cut into their flank. Iraqi crews scrambled to respond, but the storm had clouded their optics. Their rounds fell short, wide, or into empty sand. The American fire control computers did not miss. Within minutes, entire lines of tanks began to burn. T-72s exploded in waves. One had its turret launched nearly 30 meters into the air. Another cooked off internally, the crew never opening the hatch. American gunners reloaded before Iraqis could even sight in. An Iraqi forward observer, desperate, radioed command. "We are being flanked by machines. They do not stop. They do not miss." There was no air support, no stealth jets, no helicopters. This was armor on armor, steel against steel. But it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. In just 23 minutes, Eagle Troop destroyed over 40 armored vehicles, many before the Iraqis even fired a shot. No American tank was lost. No crewmen injured. Their speed, vision, and coordination created a perfect envelope. See first, strike first, destroy without exposure. A Soviet-trained doctrine shattered in real time, back in Moscow when the battle reports reached the desks of Armor Command. They didn't believe them. "Impossible," one general said. They faced a superior force, but satellite photos didn't lie. Dozens of wrecks, no American losses. The humiliation wasn't just the kill ratio. It was the asymmetry. One side moved as a thinking machine. The other stood still, blind, waiting to die. Soviet armor theory had been predicated on engagement at range, coordinated mass, and survivability under fire. At 73 Easting, every assumption was obliterated at a cost of seconds. And as the fires died down, one truth remained. The battlefield had changed. Forever. What shattered at 73 Easting wasn't just a formation, it was a philosophy. The Soviet Union had built its entire military identity on hard numbers, tons of steel, kilometers of armor, tens of thousands of shells, and a doctrine that believed the battlefield was ruled by mass, not intelligence, And for decades, that belief had worked. But in the aftermath of Desert Storm, Soviet analysts could no longer ignore the obvious. American forces weren't just better equipped. They were operating under an entirely different logic. First came the statistical reckoning. Kill ratios weren't 1-1, they were 20-1. Entire armored brigades vanished before even seeing the enemy. SAM batteries were destroyed before acquiring targets. Ground troops surrendered not after hours of combat, but minutes under digital bombardment. And unlike previous wars, where victory came from sacrifice, the Americans had won with surgical cleanliness. This didn't just challenge Soviet strategy, it humiliated its core assumptions. Information had replaced mass. The Americans weren't throwing more troops into battle. They were deploying better ones, supported by data networks that amplified every action. Precision had replaced saturation. Instead of blanketing an area with shells, a single tank destroyed multiple enemies with pinpoint fire, guided by satellites and thermals. Computing had replaced manpower. What Soviet armies did with hundreds of staff officers, the Americans did with a command system fed by real-time data and microprocessors. Integration had replaced hierarchy. Instead of rigid chains of command and sectorized units, American doctrine fused air, ground, space, and sea into one vision. Every branch spoke the same language, digital. These weren't just tactical improvements. They were a different civilization of warfare. And perhaps most devastating, the Americans didn't wait for permission. Field commanders adjusted in real time. Frontline tank crews shared intelligence with pilots, drones, and artillery units without needing Moscow-style authorization chains. Soviet thinkers began to grasp the true gap. Their system wasn't just slower, it was blind. Their weapons weren't just outdated, they were out of context. Their soldiers weren't just undertrained, they were disconnected from the battlefield itself. By the end of 1991, as the Soviet Union teetered politically, its military elite faced a private truth no doctrine could erase. They had lost a war they never entered. Not because their tanks were worse, not because their pilots were less brave, but because their entire worldview had already been outmaneuvered. The battlefield had evolved into a network, and the Soviet mind was still fighting with steel. Somewhere in the Kuwaiti desert, the turret of a Soviet-made T-72 lies half buried in the sand, blown clean off its hull by a force it never saw. Wind sweeps across the wreckage, carving small dunes around what was once a weapon of war, now just rusted memory. There are no footprints, no battle lines, no bloodstains, only silence and wreckage. Above, a dark triangle glides through the night sky. No roar, no contrail, just the silhouette of an F-117 Nighthawk. Black against black, returning to base after another surgical strike. It doesn't linger, it doesn't announce itself. It vanishes like it arrived invisible. This was the battlefield the Soviet Union never truly believed in. A war fought without massed formations, without artillery barrages, without wave attacks. It wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about disappearance, detection, and decision executed faster than the enemy could even comprehend. In the corridors of power back in Moscow, they had predicted a long war, fought with layers of defense and crushing reserves. They had imagined battles of attrition, tank duels, and radar-guided air intercepts. Instead, they got deletion. Entire regiments reduced to smoldering icons on satellite maps. Command centers decapitated before orders could be issued. Tanks turned to scrap in less than 30 seconds. A military theory written over half a century, made irrelevant in half an hour. The Cold War did not end in Berlin. It did not end with treaties, handshakes, or parades. It ended in rooms full of men who refused to believe the truth. And by the time they did, it was already over.